Welcome to this Deep Dive Explainer. Today, we're taking a really close look at an incredible piece of work by Dr. Thomaz Edson Veloso de Silva. It's called Avaliar para Aprender, or Assessing to Learn. We're going to unpack this source material to completely challenge practically everything we think we know about grading, testing, and assessment in our schools. Seriously, if you're an educator, a student, or honestly just someone fascinated with how we actually learn, this analysis is designed to flip your perspective completely upside down. So let's get into it.
Right off the bat, if you've ever felt totally exhausted by those endless cycles of testing, correcting, and grading, maybe you've run a few red pens completely dry this semester, well, Dr. Silva hits us with a brilliant medical metaphor that exposes a fundamental absurdity in all of this. He says, assessing without acting is diagnosing without treating. Think about that for a second. Imagine going to a doctor, getting all this expensive blood work done, getting a serious diagnosis, and then the doctor just sends you home with a score on your chart. No medicine, no treatment plan, just a score. That is exactly what we're doing to students when we just hand them a grade, but fail to actually adjust our teaching.
To understand how to fix this, we first need to understand how we actually got here in the first place. So let's look at part 1, the measurement paradigm. You see, our current grading systems weren't actually designed to foster genuine student learning. They were built way back during the industrial era to manage massive student populations, basically to sort and rank who gets to move forward. And they do this by providing this illusion of objectivity. A simple number like a 7 out of 10, well, it feels so precise, right? But here's the catch. The school accurately measures what it often does not deeply understand. Sure, a number tells you a student missed some questions, but it tells you absolutely nothing about the cognitive process behind those mistakes. And worse, this traditional measurement paradigm actively harms students. Over time, when we just sort and rank them, we aren't showing them what they need to learn next. Instead, we're slowly, systematically teaching them that they simply can't do it. And eventually, they internalize that final grade as their actual identity.
Which brings us to a much-needed paradigm shift. Part 2, evidence, interpretation, and action.
Listen, assessment is not a period at the end of a sentence. It's a comma. It's a pause meant to provide direction. When assessment is viewed as just the end result, we completely miss its power as a tool to guide the ongoing journey of learning. Dr. Silva redefines this whole process by breaking it down into a continuous loop of formative assessment, consisting of 3 deeply connected steps: evidence, interpretation, and action. And you can't just pick and choose one of these. They completely rely on one another to function. Think about it. An assessment that produces evidence but isn't interpreted is literally just a pile of data. An interpretation without action, that's just a sterile diagnosis. And action without evidence is just a teacher guessing at what might work. They absolutely have to operate as one integrated system.
So in the real world, assessment is actually an inferential process. As an educator, you start at the bottom layer with observable evidence. And we're not just talking about a formal test here. It's the traces of learning you see everywhere. It's written answers, sure, but it's also a hesitation during an oral presentation or the specific strategies a student attempts to use. But you can't just stop at observation. You have to traverse upwards to the middle layer, making deep cognitive inferences. You really have to interpret why they answered that way. And finally, that interpretation leads you to the top layer, the pedagogical decision. You take that inference and you use it to intervene in a meaningful way.
But how do we ensure our interpretations are actually fair and accurate? Well, it comes down to one golden rule. Without clear criteria, there is no interpretation. There's only judgment. If students don't know what a quality answer looks like before they even start the work, they aren't really being assessed. They're just being forced to play a guessing game about what's inside the teacher's head. And when expectations remain a secret, assessment devolves into completely arbitrary judgment. So transparency isn't just a nice-to-have thing. It is the absolute prerequisite for any real interpretation of student learning. Let's see how this builds into the classroom application phase. Part 3, from error to feedback.
If we genuinely want to assess to learn, we have to completely redefine our relationship with mistakes. In traditional schooling, an error is a failure, right? It's treated like a bug in the system that needs to be penalized and squashed as quickly as possible. But if we take a constructivist perspective, error is not the opposite of learning. It's a constitutive, essential part of it. An error isn't the absence of knowledge. It's really just a temporary, in-progress form of a student's cognitive organization. When we shift to seeing errors as stepping stones rather than roadblocks, the entire dynamic of the classroom changes.
To really grasp this, we've got to break down the actual layers of a mistake. At the very surface layer, the visible layer, we just see the wrong answer on the page. But as we dig into the intermediate layer, we find the specific strategy the student applied incorrectly. And if we dig even deeper to the profound layer, that's where we find the core mental models, or maybe the missing prerequisites that caused the issue in the first place. Think about it. If a teacher only ever penalizes that surface layer, the student will literally never grow. We have to read that deep layer carefully to figure out exactly how to help them rebuild their path.
This brings us to a pretty stark contrast. Far too often, we confuse correction with feedback. Now, correction is binary. It's merely pointing out what's right or wrong, focusing entirely on the past and solely on the final product. True feedback, on the other hand, is interpretive. It focuses on the future, and it engages with the student's internal process. Simply handing a student a test covered in red check marks, that's just correction. It just points out the damage. Genuine feedback is what actually helps them rebuild their learning pathway for the next attempt.
So, how do we actually craft that genuine feedback? Well, drawing on Hattie and Timperley's renowned educational model, the author stresses that effective feedback must answer 3 very specific questions for the learner. Where am I going? How am I going? And crucially, what is the next step? Seriously, without that third question, feedback is kind of useless. And here is the real secret behind this whole framework. The ultimate goal isn't for the teacher to just answer these questions forever. No, the goal is to create autonomous students who can eventually assess themselves and answer these questions on their own.
Now let's zoom out a bit. Part 4, the integrated system.
Because here's the reality. A single teacher cannot carry the weight of this paradigm shift all by themselves. These pedagogical choices absolutely must be supported by an overarching institutional culture. A healthy system operates on 3 levels. First, we have the micro level, right in the classroom with continuous observation. Then, the meso level, within the school itself. Think collective analysis and staff meetings. And finally, the macro level of large-scale standardized testing. The big problem today. These levels are heavily fragmented. For this to actually work, large-scale data from the top must flow back down into the classroom to be useful. If macro data doesn't translate into micro-level action, it is completely disconnected from the actual reality of learning.
Which leads us to an incredibly sharp warning about the modern era of education. Look around. Today, we are obsessed with data. We have massive dashboards, beautiful statistical charts, and incredible tracking systems. But diagnosis without action is just a sophisticated form of pedagogical inertia. You can have literally all the data in the world, but if it ultimately fails to change a single teaching practice, if it doesn't result in a different conversation with a struggling student, it is completely useless. It's just what we call inert evaluation. To bring it all together, I want to end this explainer with a profound call to self-reflection, pulled directly from the author's own assessment tool. Does my assessment promote learning? And don't just think about the formal tests here. Think about the daily interactions, the feedback you give, the exact way a student's error is handled in the moment. Ask yourself, is your assessment merely classifying and sorting, or is it actively developing and supporting? It's a question every single educator must ask themselves every time they step into the classroom. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep pursuing knowledge that truly makes a difference.